I was born. And there I died. It was only a moment for you. You took no notice.
Hello and welcome. This is more or less our first official episode of this podcast, The Longview at the Redwood Society. I am your host, Dave Green, along with Quill from the Redwood Society of California. I think it's fair to say we are an OGC affiliate. And we have as our honored guest today, Johann Kurtz, who's the author of this book that I have just received via Amazon Mail a day ago. It is Leaving a Legacy. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Dave.
Well, this has been a long time coming, I have to say. I have been a huge fan of your Substack for the longest time. And I became even a larger fan of your work when I had a chance to see your speech at what was it? I can't remember the exact. I think it was the Vuitton event in England. And since then, I've been looking forward to this book. It's very appropriate, and it's called "Leaving a Legacy." Do you just want to give an introduction to sort of your work and the inspiration for the book?
Sure. It sort of emerges out of the blog you mentioned, Becoming Noble. But there was this viral topic that you'd see recur on Twitter and elsewhere, flared up again recently, about older generations, the sort of wealthy boomers disinheriting their children. Particularly celebrities would do this virtue signaling tour where they would make a big show out of saying, we're not leaving our wealth to our children, we're going to give it to charity. And this was presented as a kind of morally celebrated act. And this also comes against the backdrop of other more subtle forms of disinheritance, mostly the phenomenon of the older generation spending their wealth down in a way that would have been very historically unusual to prior generations. The whole sort of golf and cruises tour, the large mansions and so forth. And so what I wanted to do was, I saw that there was a lot of outrage against these announcements, but people didn't quite have the moral language to express exactly why it was wrong to not give your wealth to charity rather than to your children. I mean, because presumably wealth corrupts children, while wealth empowers charities. Charities do good in the world. And so I started to sort of pull at that thread. And what actually emerged was quite a rich tapestry of interrelated ideas, all of which I think are relevant to our guys, like what is the meaning of meritocracy versus loyalty? How are these philosophically defensible? What is the philosophical defense of partiality? So the notion that it is actually morally licit and necessary to preference one's own. How does this fit into the theological tradition of the West and Christianity itself? What is the kind of moral structure of family? And what is the place of a multi-generational elite in upholding aesthetics, culture, spiritual and physical health of the people that they serve, and so forth? So it turned into this kind of rich book, which sounds a bit intense, but it is very much presented as something that you could give to your parents. It's written in very approachable language. There's no aggressive or sort of confrontational presentation in that. And as I wrote it, I actually realized it was this subject happens to be quite a good vehicle to present our ideas to a curious older audience in an approachable form.
This is actually something that's perfect for a book, because a lot of times the problem with books, and I'm struggling with this myself, is trying to find a topic that has not been covered before. And you always know a perfect topic, in my opinion, for an essay or maybe even a book, because you're staring at something like the boomer dispossessing their descendants or their immediate children. And it's wrong. There's something that's fundamentally wrong about what they're doing, but you can't quite put your finger on it. So I'm actually, in the speech, Johann, I've read 10 pages of the book. I should have read more. I got a little bit later than I anticipated and had a much busier Thanksgiving break than I anticipated too. But I want to play some devil's advocate here to see how you bat away the obvious boomer uh, critiques of inheritance. Why should children who don't work for their money get it from their parents? This is a lottery. This is the absolute antithesis of what we would ordinarily associate with the terms meritocracy. The children are getting this from boomers who just happen to be born at the right time in the right place to enjoy post-war prosperity. And now they're getting this windfall that nobody else gets. And how is this just not going to further create the type of spoiled entitlement that has to this point already ruined the West?
You do a very good impression there. That was scary. That was like talking to.
Yeah, dark side.
So I think, like, to Steelman the case, there is this legitimate concern that handing on a lot of liquid wealth to an individual who is just starting out their career might interrupt that process, might interrupt their commitment to learning the virtues of discipline, of industry, of entrepreneurship. And these things are virtues, like they are important for young men. And it is good for young men, in some sense, to be hungry. On the other hand, we have to balance that against the observation that really what built the West, what made the West the wonderful, beautiful place it is some sense of multi-generational great works and stewardship of particular places that caused an investment in the architecture, the art, the family businesses that we hold so dear. So the canonical example, it's not a universally useful one, but is this sense of a cathedral, which is stewarded by multiple generations of upclass or indeed aristocratic families, is nourished, is patronized, is improved. And there is this wonderful sense of this emergent, complex, grand thing, which is also a living embodiment of the continued values being passed on from generation to generation. So how do you square that circle? How do you hold these two things in tension? It's complex, but I'd say that the essence of it is, and you have to kind of scale this to your material situation. Obviously, most people reading this book will not be the ultra wealthy, but I think there's a useful lesson in here for all our families, since we live basically in a time of at least material consumer abundance. The problem is not the possession of wealth itself, because there are many, many great figures and indeed families in history who have managed to continue wealth, and I look at some of them in the book, throughout multiple generations. The problem is not scaling your ambitions to account for the wealth or possessions you have. In other words, if you undertake a challenge that is so great that it is very difficult to achieve, even with a degree of material prosperity, you then are forced to embody the virtues of discipline, of industry, of this virtue of magnanimity, which is greatness of mind, stretching forth your mind to great things. And so the argument in the book is basically that the problem is not providing your children with a measure of wealth, because in almost all cases, this wealth can be constructively used to get children on the property market at a time when that's very challenging, to help them start a family and attract a wife at a time when that is very challenging. In some sense, this transition is necessary. The question is more, how do we construct a metaphysical and indeed physical framework around your family such that they have this disposition towards undertaking challenging works in the spiritual domain and the physical domain, in the uplifting of the community, such that they never feel comfortable, they never feel purposeless, they never feel adrift in that sense that people are concerned about with money. And so one of the things that I didn't expect the book to turn into, but it sort of had to, was this dissection of how the great aristocratic families have raised their children, or at least how the successful multi-generational aristocratic families, because there are plenty that have failed, have raised their children to imbue this sense of greatness of mind, and how these children have gone on to achieve great things as a result.
So I'm so glad you brought this up, because I had to check out the authorship of this poem, but it's amazing that you're kind of hitting right on the problems that I foresaw. And I think, I haven't finished the book yet, but I can kind of pick up what you're putting down. So I'm going to continue to challenge you here. So Americans, at least, and I'm sure there's an equivalent of this in England, but we were raised with this image that is very much like this folk song or poem. You might know this if you're a folk music fan like myself. I'm working on a piece about folk music right now. It's called Richard Cory. It's a poem by Edward Arlington Robinson, and it was most famously sung, I think, by Simon and Garfunkel. And it's about this, this industrialist and Richard Cory. He's the son of this industrialist, and the singer works in his factory. And every day he wishes he was like Richard Cory. He's throwing all these parties because he has all this wealth. And then eventually, like Richard Cory, just like after he has all this wealth, he just kills himself because he's this useless playboy. And the guy who's working in his factory can't figure it out. And I think that, this is the image that's implanted by, well, at least for the entire 20th century, basically from the 1890s going forward, was this image of the playboy. Literally, the problem is in the name. The playboy is the inheritor of great wealth from an industrious father, but he does not inherit the role attendant to the wealth. And therefore, it is not necessarily wasted. It goes into how Richard Cory is giving it to charity and building libraries with it. But nothing about the wealth has an attendant mission attached to it. So this is what eventually, according to this poem / folk song, is what destroys Richard Cory, is his inability to wield this fortune that has been bequeathed to him because it has no purpose attached to it. It seems like you're getting at something like that there has to be a telos along with the inheritance of some type.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Let me make a structural observation first, and then I'll sort of embed that in what I believe is the correct metaphysical framework. So there's an American sociologist, E. Digby Baltzell, very, very, very useful and an interesting figure. I very much recommend his book, Puritan Boston and Quaker Massachusetts. Essentially, he's the sort of sociologist of the elites. He coined the term WASP, White Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and he spent a lot of time in particular researching the Boston Brahmins, which were Boston's upper class, sort of formed over hundreds of years when it was there. I know this is a very Yarvin idea, but the history is
I've known that term for my entire life, Boston Brahmins, even before I knew what a Brahmin was. It's kind of a weird term for someone from Massachusetts, but it fits, I guess, right?
In Digby Baltzell's sociological model, he contrasts elites and then an upper class. Elites are self-made men. They're upwardly mobile. They're defined by the kind of purpose you're talking about, which is the accumulation of wealth, power, successful entrepreneurship. They make things happen. They're dynamic. They're meritocratic. They inject society with this fresh blood, this dynamism. But it becomes pathological when those elites don't form an upper class. What is meant by that is they intermarry. They recognize that their children are being born into a place of privilege, which will require a new mission, a new purpose, because those children will not be able to tap into the same fundamental entrepreneurial hunger that they did if they came from a lower status. And so what an upper class does is it takes on this role of the stewardship of taste, of manners, etiquette, aesthetics, architecture, artistic patronage, spiritual leadership, and so forth. And at their best, the Boston Brahmins eventually degenerated, but at their best, they very much inhabited this role. They sort of built Harvard and the various Boston museums, the Genealogical Society, some of the great architectural works. They really made it into a jewel in America's crown. We're quite a long way from that now. The point being that once this forms, you have this stable upper class, which is hopefully continuously refreshed by the kind of new blood rising up through the meritocratic ranks, but who themselves are able to act as the steward of the highest aspects of society, of fine culture. They're then able to present the ascendant class with a kind of deal, which is, we will offer you the marriage of your children into our class. We will offer you access to our social clubs, to our relationships and existing capital, to our institutions. In return, you must take up your mantle as someone who is a leader of society, who does not get divorced, who does not inject sort of crass material into the public domain, who upholds our laws of etiquette, of fair play, of honor, of national service. So there's a sort of like stability there. Now, when that transition doesn't take place, that's where you see a lot of dysfunction. You just have like an elite which tries to form their children into another elite. Like it's a perpetual, it's a weird cycle where everyone's trying to be first generation wealth, even in the context of inherited wealth, which doesn't quite work.
Which is where you get this. this weird concept that you hear about in the American context, privilege, right? Which is, again, this is very Yarvin-esque too. I think it literally means private law, but it's this idea that you don't have a role that you're playing. You've got kind of like a ticket to the front of the line, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. And in that sense, it actually makes sense. If we're all supposed to be playing the same meritocratic, upwardly mobile, non-class-based game, then having someone who starts life with this massive liquid injection of capital does sort of upset that logic. On the other hand, I do think there is a defensible place for a stable upper class. The way that I refer to this in the book is, this is a post-enlightenment podcast, so I can explain this unashamedly in a way that I did a finance podcast last week, and I was like, okay, I'm about to critique the Enlightenment. I know that I'm going way off the rails for a finance podcast, but here I feel much more at home. The kind of post-Lockean view of property is an atrophied one, I think, which is that it's sort of something like, it is mine, I can do what I want with it, it is for any purpose I choose, because it is private property, it is mine. I am the sovereign of this asset. An older view that would have been more familiar to the kind of stewards of Christendom was this notion of, let's say, dominion, right? So it's Andrew Willard-Jones, the theologian, describes this as dominion carries with it the burden of rule. In other words, there is no valuable, powerful asset that does not teleologically contain some purpose, some duty, some notion of stewardship, this much more living relationship to property. And this is the kind of Christian vision of, to he whom much has been given, much will be demanded. It's this notion that is much closer to a notion of kingship. Dominion is useful in this regard. I won't go into the full theological history here, but dominion, as opposed to property, still contains this relational aspect. Dominion is from dominium, lordship, kingship. Eventually it's from domus, that's the root word, which is house. So it's this notion that it's something that endures, it's something that nurtures, it's something that is for the family, for the community around the family. And that is equally the foundation of my argument against spending your wealth down or giving it away later in life. And I think it's an invigorating one. I mean, one of the things that this allows you to do is approach the older generations with a spirit of great optimism and say, actually, you still have this powerful Christian duty. You still have a purpose. There's still this incredibly rich body of history and theology for you to tap into as a patriarch. It's a sort of honorable title as opposed to just the slightly crass and boring thing of, P&O cruises or whatever.
Yeah. And I mean, this is an interesting, this provides a challenge for us here, because when we're talking about patriarchy in the traditional sense, we're talking about interfacing with a society of patriarchs. In our own world, we are interfacing with a society that is entirely mercantilized. And I don't want to dig my critique in too much. I haven't read the book yet, but I mean, so we have to deal with, for instance, if we were, even if we were an arrangement of families, we'd still have to deal with the fact that the wealth earned between families would dynamically shift, even if we were ideologically aligned, so to speak. And so along with that, so too would the obligations. So I imagine that we will have to kind of adjust and struggle with this concept of I don't know. I mean, I don't want to copy your blog, but it feels like you're struggling with the concept of nobility in a highly dynamic age.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is a struggle we need to have, because in the absence, it may be impossible, as I think you're implying, that out of a purely mercantile age, this fully fledged nobility will naturally emerge, no matter how carefully we approach these ideas philosophically. But we do need to make some kind of progressive movement in that direction, because what's happened at the moment is, if you don't have these multi-generational projects, vision, aspirations, you end up in a situation in which every generation is ruled over by the nouveau riche, whoever has been massively upwardly mobile within this generation. And that is like, instead of being ruled by a kind of refined mercantile class. It's like being ruled by an unrefined mercantile class. So the most important cultural figure is someone like Elon Musk, who, you know, I'm a great appreciator of SpaceX. I'm not an Elon Musk hater, but when he's, you know, moving into sort of artistic patronage and posting, I had to block Grok and various other of his endeavors on my timeline because they're just like posting smut onto my timeline. So it's like, so that there's this problem is heightened when we don't make any, and you know, it, say what you like about the Medici. The Medici were not morally upstanding in the kind of pure Christian sense as we would understand them, but they nevertheless at least left behind great works of art that continue to be architecture, really cultural flourishing more generally, and indeed financial prosperity that we continue to appreciate millennia later. So that the best of the kind of mercantile class is significantly preferable to the kind of unrefined mercantile class that we're subject to now.
I will have to say, Quill, now I have you on. I remember at the event in Oregon we had, I'm sure you've spoken to this person, but Kevin Dolan, the leader of the Exit Group, was giving
Yeah, I
a
was exactly
presentation.
thinking of him as well. A lot of the ideas he touched on in his speech was very similar to the stuff that is in this book.
Well, specifically, he hits on one common note, and this is where everyone is saying kind of this gap, and he brings up the very famous and erogenous study with wolves that identified alpha wolves and beta wolves and gamma wolves and all this stuff. When really this creation of this very rigid and violent hierarchy was more or less a function of the wolves being in captivity, and in the wild they form a much more natural familial it's still a hierarchy, but it's something that we as humans would recognize much more readily as being a patriarchy matriarchy combination, you know, with the wolves being in a much more natural arrangement. And his idea was to kind of re-engineer that. And I think this is getting to what you're saying is there's this gap in the modern world where it appears that the groups that help themselves collectively are able to succeed in ways that purely individualistic forces do not, because in this purely individualistic environment, everyone is going to defect the second the gun is taken away from their head, or the second the carrot is moved from out from in front of their eyes. And I think that's what we're kind of seeing here, you know. And I guess what do you see as the opportunities to insert something in this location where there is currently nothing?
Yeah. So I'd say I'll answer the question, but to frame the book as it was intended, basically I'm offering myself a disclaimer here that I don't have all the answers. The book is really intended for an individual family to reason through the decisions that will be available to them at any stage in their material and human journey. And I don't think it's a solution. Like that's my disclaimer outright to society at large. Like I have views and they're implicit in the philosophical foundation that's laid out. But this is very much a book for a single family or patriarch, as opposed to a like, here's Johann's grand vision for fixing everything. However,
yeah, I don't want to put you on the spot for solving the problem of Western civilization.
No, we'll get by the end of this podcast. Well, I'm sure we'll have
we'll have nailed it, I'm sure.
One of the problems with the current arrangement is that there's no iterative dimension to our existence over generations. In other words, a culture of honor and fair play can only be sustained when it is assumed that the same families will be playing the same game in a generation, in 2, 3, 4, 5 generations. Because I am then incentivized to engage in the long-term interests of the stability of the integrity of the entire community, because I want to be seen as a valuable player who is worth bringing into valuable games, because I will play with honor and integrity. And indeed, the particular Anglo virtue of fair play was first instantiated in sort of the British upper classes, the games of the aristocratic schools, and so forth. And I think we've kind of lost that when the honor attached to your particular family name becomes an unimportant factor in society. I think that's a real loss. And so any sense in which we can set up this communities or tight-knit networks of families who actually have relationships with each other, not just as individuals, but as families, who expect to have the same web of relationships a generation, 2 generations from now, that naturally escapes the prisoner's dilemma, which I think brings out the worst in the mercantile classes, which is kind of like you're only playing a single version of this game. You want to maximally smash and grab as much wealth as you can. You've got one lifetime to do it, and then the game starts all over again with totally different players, totally different names, and they'll have the same set of incentives. So when this becomes an iterative and stable game, structurally speaking, the incentives become much healthier. That obviously brings in the next question of how do you actually bring about that architecture? And maybe, I'm sure Kevin's work is very useful there. But it's an aspiration that I think we should be moving towards.
No, I think that's an excellent. Cool. Did you have any follow-up?
Yeah, I did have a thought, because as you're saying that, I'm thinking we live in a state right now where, especially in America, communities are very hypermobile, and most communities don't even have roots as a foundation to go off of. So you're kind of starting from zero in that question of you're dealing with multi-generational communities or families in your community, but people bounce around all over in America. So how do you even lay down roots in the first place to deal with that problem?
Yeah, I mean, the answer, frankly, is that, like, if you're not going to live stably in a place for multiple generations, you're not going to be able to access much of the sort of. I mean, like, if you look at, I like quoting this. If you look at the works of Tocqueville, for example, he sort of laments the instability of the geographical spread of Americans. He has this wonderful line in defending the concept of a family estate, the family house. He says, all generations are, as it were, contemporaneous, which is like when you live in the same place as your ancestors did, when you live in the same place that your future generations will, you feel a kind of shared community with them in this very intense fashion. You feel, the legacy items that they've left behind, their portraits, you see and you live in the things they've built. It's this very intense lived relationship with your forefathers that is more difficult to sustain in a highly mobile culture. A highly mobile culture obviously brings other advantages. And you can see why America had to be that way in the kind of frontier age when more parts of the country were continuously opening up. I think it would be a great shame if, as America now exists within settled borders, at least for the time being, there wasn't some return to a culture of rootedness, of place, because that there are unique factors that brings. And I do think, should any given family have the choice to spread throughout the country or to remain rooted in a single place, absent, I mean, there's like a carve out for young men who are going off on adventures at the beginning of their lives. But aside from that carve out, there are a whole host of reasons why it's beneficial, culturally speaking, spiritually, for a family to remain accessible to each other. That being said, there is a great American vehicle for dynastic processes in America, which is the family business. There are these great family business empires in American history. The kind of paradigm that has been assumed into popular culture is shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves within 3 generations, but there are many counterexamples of families that have done this far more intelligently than the Vanderbilts did. And there you still, I mean, the great thing about a family estate is that, yes, you pass on wealth when you pass it to your children, but you're also passing on complexity to manage, responsibilities in the domain of patronage, of economic management of the sort of client families around you. So you're passing on both privilege, but also you're making great demands of them, which inculcates the sense of greatness of mind that I mentioned earlier. Family businesses in many ways can do the same if you intelligently assume the heir into the business. It's this important merger of wealth and duty that need to come together in the minds of people who have this generational vision.
Yeah, that is interesting too. I'm going to piss off a lot of people in the chat when I I mentioned this example, but as a young child, I discovered this book in my grandfather's house about one very entrepreneurial family, both in Europe and America, called the Rothschilds. And this family was able. I don't want to engage in any speculation. This was a very neutral history that I read. And it was very fascinating, though, that, regardless of what you think about their politics or whatnot, it was interesting how the family could be divided, yet function kind of like a modern corporation, which I think was the thesis of the book. And it simultaneously felt a little bit wholesome, but also a little bit creepy. It felt in some sense like the Rothschilds were simultaneously this very strange missing link between corporation and aristocratic family, and in some ways represented a deracination of the European idea of sort of this international family like the Habsburgs or the Bourbons or whatever. I don't know. I don't want to throw a monkey wrench into the thing, but I mean, it does seem like we'd have to come up with some kind of thing like that, though, considering how dynamic everything is. I said that being a nomad most of my life, but I don't know. I feel like that needs to be something needs to be said because that's what I'm struggling with currently.
Yeah, I mean,
not much of a question. I'm sorry, but
yeah.
do you think that could still be done, where there would be a family spread across a country and have it still have that sense of obligation and telos that we would want?
Theoretically, I think the British aristocracy, which is something I'm somewhat familiar with here, is a good example in that there was an aristocracy of the land, and an aristocracy of the land is necessarily dispersed because you have landed estates. Each estate has to be surrounded by a certain amount of farmland, potentially villages, and so forth. And so the upper class of the kingdom were distributed, they were potentially hundreds of miles away from each other, and yet they saw themselves as members of a continuous body. The way that they sustained this was by having a rigid social calendar. And they took socialization so seriously that society with a capital S became a noun in the UK, as in it was a fully fledged set of events, expectations, etiquette, procedures, initiations. So these are like debutante balls. These are, the Georgian marriage season. These are one of the things you discover if you move to the English countryside is that you're incredibly isolated if you're not very intentional about this, which is you constantly need to be in communication with other families, figuring out who's going to visit who, on what dates, where they're going to stay, do you have a spare room? So and this was done in an age before modern communications technology. So I think it is absolutely possible, but I think we're quite, outside of a few great American traditions, Thanksgiving, Christmas, we're quite lax about that now. Certainly this whole process of initiation rituals whereby someone is assumed into a class and then recognized in the community, in front of the community as an accepted and official member of that class, and ideally married into the class and assuming the obligations of family and so forth to stabilize things. That whole set of infrastructure has atrophied, and that distributed paradigm, I think, is sustainable, but it comes with it this obligation to build the social foundation, which must necessarily underpin it.
That's a really good answer to the question. I mean, I guess Cool, did you have any follow-up?
Yeah, well, I'm just noticing that a lot of those traditions are lacking in America. Like the concepts you mentioned, the debutante balls, those types of things are very foreign to us here. And it is disappointing that there's only really Thanksgiving and Christmas those are the only holidays where that's any kind of familial thing that's celebrated. And I'm curious as to why that is, where you see that, where we got to that stage where that's just not a thing.
Yeah, I mean, well, to be honest, it's atrophied in the UK as well. And there's some kind of combination now of like nouveau riche versions of the old events, which kind of embody the aesthetics and they make for nice Instagram opportunities, but aren't quite the real thing because they don't come with them any metaphysical expectations. It's just a kind of nice event. The family of Chris Martin and Gwyneth Paltrow went to Les Bals de Débutants in Paris and so forth, which is this kind of glitzy, but not quite real initiation event. So it's atrophied here as well. There's a kind of soft and unspoken version of this. Like there's a famous agricultural university in the UK. Well, it's famous only amongst people who kind of know about it, but it's this weird thing where all the wealthy, like landowning classes send their children either to Oxford, Cambridge, or this like totally unknown agricultural college where they all kind of mingle and so forth.
Interesting.
So it's atrophied here as well. I think that like basically these events are only sustainable in an atmosphere of confidence because they're fundamentally an assertion of difference. So if I have an event whereby I initiate my children and my friends' children into a class structure, I need to be comfortable asserting the need for that class structure, the purpose for that class structure, the differentness of the upper class, what its role is, how I can justify this partiality. And indeed, I need to tie this into a sort of metaphysical tradition. And I think, Christmas and these other events, they kind of live on with renewed vigor because they have this metaphysical component to them and people still ultimately believe in their telos and their purpose. And we've kind of lost all of that to various degrees. The Pascal Emmanuel Gaubry, big on X, I'm sure you're familiar with. He has
I'm a big fan of his on Twitter.
Yeah. As any good reactionary Catholic should be. He had a really interesting piece on his Substack a few years ago. I can't remember. He titled it something provocative, like the French's secret selective breeding program or whatever. But essentially, in France, the elite, the aristocracy, are quietly in the background far more politically and socially and religiously radical than those of the Anglosphere. They're much more self-confident in their identity, in expressing their difference and their separation from mainstream society. And as such, they have quietly maintained a lot of the social infrastructure in a much more intense way. And Le Chalet is essentially the unofficial quiet series of events by which they make sure that their children are meeting each other, meeting the right sort from a young age, again and again. And, they learn to dance, they learn to socialize, etc. They're attending specific events in the hopes that they sort of intermarry. And so we've moved on from actual arranged marriages, but we've moved into the kind of sphere of curated marriages. So something like that I think is necessary. But in answer to your broader question, I do think like before you define the social calendar, because social events are difficult if you're going to get people from around the country to attend, you need a purpose, you need a justification, you need confidence. So that's kind of the underlying question is what are we becoming and how can we justify that?
Indeed, I think that this is the struggle I see is we are all kind of middle class people. Well, I'm a middle class person that my parents, I think, briefly shot up into upper middle class very briefly in the late 90s and early 2010s. And I think now we're back in the middle class and we're not in a position to have an aristocratic tradition, but we still miss one ruling up over us. And I guess the question is, how do you rebuild that when it never was really part of your family history in so many words, either in the old country or the new country?
Well, I mean, the aristocratic version of this is the celebrated one, because it's in Pride and Prejudice and Jane Austen. But really all classes had this version of an intense social calendar of events which would get sort of local villages together. There were all kinds of festivals. I was reading, there's a very good book. I mean, it's kind of odd to read now because it's as all 19th century literature is. There's all these weird literary conventions where you spend like 40 pages describing a train ride or whatever. It's like way too long. But still, for anyone who enjoys, anyone who's an Anglophile, I'd recommend Tom Brown's School Days, which is about a boy going to rugby for the first time in the 19th century. and it was written by one of the great founders of the kind of muscular Christian movement. So it's very good. There's lots of rugby and fights, and but also this, in top hats. It's good stuff. I've completely forgotten why I brought that up. Yeah. At the beginning of the book. At the beginning of the book, he's still in his village before he goes off to rugby, and it is described he's like the local posh boy, essentially, like from the ruling family. But he attends the kind of village fair, and there's all these like there's like ritualized stick fighting, dueling, and the like girls from the different villages come over to like watch the different men compete in wrestling, catch as catch can, like all this different. So there is, which is not to suggest that you're from like a local farming family or peasant or whatever.
Well, my grandmother was indeed born a part of a farming family on the Danube, so she had kind of this thing going. Although we're totally disconnected from it now. It was almost 100 years ago, but it's still almost there. It was within I had a big relationship with my grandmother, so it's almost there. It's just, it sounds like perhaps sports might be an avenue to get back into a pattern like this. It's so strange because I always think of sports as being simultaneously incredibly healthy, but also very corrupted in our modern society, or sports culture, at least.
Well, at least mainstream sports are. Yeah. The commercialized version. It's totally
like
lost
it used to
any
be.
sense.
It used to be like college football was the more healthy version as opposed to the NFL's commercialized version. And now college football is super commercialized, and it feels like a corporate event too now. It's no connection to the college. Do you think maybe that might be an avenue of reconstruction?
Yes. Sorry, water.
No problem.
Part of it, for sure. I think kind of sports are like the fun icing on the cake, the cherry on the top of metaphysical structure. America is actually very good about this in the way that Britain isn't. Britain's sports players who are celebrated are almost all essentially professionals, or maybe Olympic athletes. But the main sport in the UK is football, and there is no like college sports to speak of. Like no one really cares about who's on the best university football teams. I've never been to a university football match in my life, but I started going to football and professional football and rugby games from a young age. The US is quite good in that it has this tradition of the kind of elevation of the varsity team, the player, the jock, the homecoming king. I'm not speaking from experience here. We don't have any of this in the UK, but I've always liked that the US is unafraid of celebrating its sporting heroes, its local sporting heroes, and getting them in front of the community, getting big community support behind them. Sports are basically healthy to play and unhealthy to watch, certainly in their commercialized form, because what it's supposed to be, and I think we've had a discussion about this before, what it's supposed to be is a kind of assertion of one's own community and the vitality of your community. So you go up against the next town, it's your local boys against their local boys. And to succeed, that then implicates a whole set of questions about the virtues you're inculcating in them, how healthily you're raising them, how strong your stock is. And there's this incentive for the whole community to get involved. And you have kind of like, yes, you'll have some stars, but also you'll have some kind of more clunky older folks who have to like fill in the positions you don't have covered. And it's like, it brings the whole thing together.
It's the island of misfit toys, right? That's American football is like this. American football is a beautiful game as long as it's not over optimized. And as soon as it gets to the NFL level, it's ruined because it becomes like a machine. And it's not fun unless the team has very distinct weaknesses attached to it, in my opinion, which is why it's always the most fun at the lowest possible levels where it can be safely played. But it reminds me of that whole Jeeves and Booster story where there's like this town that has a rugby competition with a neighboring town, and like Jeeves has to rig it, but then he realizes that like no one scored a goal in this competition since like the 100 Years of War or something like that. It's a historic event, but it's kind of that could be something that feels like that could be rediscovered somehow, but I don't know. Cool. Do you have any questions? I've got a few to finish off on us because I want to keep these things around an hour, but
I had one that came up earlier that you touched on a bit, was the idea of nobility and the transition of wealth and all that. Where do you kind of see, or where do you analyze that nobility falling off in the past to where we got to the stage we are now?
Well, the material component of that, and few recognize this, at least in the UK, actually lives on quite strong. One of the sets of studies that I examine in the book is this very, very useful. There's two scholars in the UK called Julian Martin and I don't know, it's Martin and Bond. I can't remember their first names. They're very interested in the trajectory of the aristocracy over the last few hundred years. Two studies in particular stand out. The first is called Trajectories of Aristocratic Wealth. And what they show is by examining probate data. So this is data on how the courts in Britain have decided upon the dividing up of inheritances when it made it to the courts. You can actually, using this process, because those records are all public, track the wealth of the great aristocratic families over hundreds of years. And what you see is that the oldest families, so the Grosvenors, Duke of Westminster, and so forth, have actually been very successful in passing their wealth up until this day, until the present day. And the Duke of Westminster inherited £9 billion in trust. He's one of the wealthiest men in the world. And that estate goes back 1,000 years to 1066, when his ancestor came over with William the Conqueror. On the other hand, there have been these various spurts of nouveau riche families who have made huge fortunes in industry and have been granted peerages. So these are new peerages, new titles, essentially. And they have almost always flamed out and disappeared from history within a generation or two. So there's this very interesting set of practices. Equally, there's another study where he looks at entries into the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, ODNB, which is, in the UK, we have two of these like social dictionary type things. The famous one is Who's Who, but you can kind of be born into Who's Who based on your family. ODNB is based on your achievements, your effects. And they look at the presence of aristocrats over the last 200-300 years in ODNB. And what you would expect is to find that aristocrats are occupying a smaller and smaller portion relative to their size of that ledger as, you know, we became a more mobile society and new people started going to Oxford who weren't aristocrats and so forth. Actually, the aristocrats who have achieved something significant in whatever the domain is increasing over time. So there are still these families that are quietly very successful. I think the obvious way in which they've failed is, I think, frankly, a lot of them have fallen away from the faith. I think the Church of England has, for better or for worse, largely collapsed at this stage. I mean, even like King Charles, defender of the faith, is clearly, I mean, like, he's struggling. He's very happy to, he reframed himself in his kingly initiation from defender of the faith to defender of the faiths. So like a kind of like nice modern Britain version of an ancient tradition. And he spends a lot of time speaking at mosques and so forth.
It's been Blairized. Sorry, it's been Blairized.
Yeah.
Continue, please.
No, well, I think, I mean, I was coming to my conclusion, which is basically that, like, materially, they continue somewhat. At least the most successful families do. Spiritually, my sense is that they have really fallen away from certainly their position of spiritual leadership. I would assume this also means faith in their private lives. And my contention would be that cometh before the fall. Like, I would expect if they don't find that faith, they will essentially stop reproducing. They will stop being able to assert their difference in the way that they need to. They will stop being able to justify their elevated status in society by attaching it to a particular purpose. So my prediction would be that collapse will be complete. But they nevertheless, they retain enough of the old traditions to be able to perpetuate successful children in the meantime.
That would be my guess too, but this is fascinating because that study you cited there. I'm going to have to look it up after this podcast, because that kind of confirmed a suspicion that I had, that what we were seeing was kind of the nouveau riche hare versus the aristocratic tortoise, and that the aristocratic tortoise would sort of win at the scale of group competition, even though the nouveau rich would always win in the individual sprint competitions inside the generations, especially if there was a massive technological upheaval. And that is, I mean, it's kind of disturbing, but at the same time, it kind of confirms what I suspected. I know. Cool. Did you have a follow-up?
No, not off the top of my head. What did you have to ask?
Well, I don't know. I'm there's almost too much to ask. I mean, I guess I have a comment that I share this idea that these aristocratic families, if they have indeed lost the faith, are going to lose their more practical asabiya, their practical clannishness that they've developed. Because I believe that I don't know anyone who really has developed why those two things are intimately connected. All we can say is that looking at history, you never see one without the other for very long. And that could be the beginning of the end. But I'm going to finish this off with 3 questions. The first question is, where do you see the real kind of this is going to be a perennial question for our guests here on the Longview. Where do you see kind of the hopeful opportunities in our future? Where do you see the green shoots? Where do you think that we talk a lot about decline in our circles? Where do you see the things that we might look to for some hope for renewal or something entirely different that would continue on the nobility that in many ways the modern world has lost?
I think the thing that I'm most excited about is reinstantiating this iterative game. One thing that I didn't expect, I started the blog as intended to be fully anonymous. That's why I chose the name Johann Kurtz, like Colonel Kurtz. It's why my profile picture was a face merge of Dolph Lundgren and Giga Chad for a long time, which was, in retrospect, a huge mistake, because then when I had to do my face reveal, it turns out I don't look like a face merge of Giga Chad.
You look quite aristocratic. I have the California sports jacket and T-shirt going on here. You're much better dressed, and so I think you have a very good author profile, if I do say so myself. But continue. Sorry.
No. But one of the things that sort of convinced me that, okay, I actually need to like quit my main career, my actual full-time job, and like come out and present myself and such, is that people started reaching out to me, readers of the blog. The blog grew quite big. Once it sort of crossed the 10,000 subscribers mark, people started reaching out to me when they came to London, because they knew I didn't make a secret of the fact I lived in London. Started meeting these guys, and they were just incredibly impressive, like really well put together, mannered. If you told me that I'd be inviting some of these guys over to have dinner with my family 5 years ago, I would have thought you were completely insane. Mm-hmm. But I did, and it's gone wonderfully, because most of these guys are family guys themselves. They've got young children, wonderful wives. And if they don't, they're extremely well put together, impressive figures. And so my obvious question then was like, well, why don't I live next to these people? I won't describe who my neighbors were in central London, but you can imagine they were quite different. So I'm like fully committed to making that happen. As you might have seen, I'm drinking Aqua Carpathia. I'm in the Carpathian, or I'm moving to the Carpathian Mountains.
Oh wow! Okay, wow. Well, that is right in Hungary, where I don't know. I won't dox you, but that's quite exciting.
No, I'm like fully doxed at this point. No, it's when I announced I was moving there, I said I was moving to Romania, to Transylvania, and Charles Hayward basically like immediately got in my comments with some kind of like Hungarian revanchism. He was like, that is rightfully Hungarian. So anyway, my point, I have a very strong conviction about like the land here is just stunning, just very beautiful. The people are wonderful, Christian people, very, very hospitable, and undergoing a sort of depopulation crisis since they joined the EU. So very hungry for sort of healthy young families to come in, especially obviously European Christian families. And I think this is like the meeting of that beautiful land with the people who have been reaching out to me and who I've discovered I'm kind of yearning to be in community with as well. I think that the coming together there could be very powerful. So we're exploring building things out here. But I think the underlying thesis is that the maturation of our community online has continued apace. Like a lot of our guys basically feel confident coming out now. A lot of them have self-doxed. Jay Burden's very handsome face has been revealed to us all recently. And I think part of that is like, yeah, Trump's in power, like the stakes are perhaps a bit lower now than they were. But also there's a recognition that like we probably are doing something important here, and we have a calling to build trust, to build personal relationships, to actually like come out and achieve real things. So I'm actually far more positive now than I have been in the past that it will be possible to convert our online network into real world things. And indeed, I've gambled my whole future on that by quitting my job and moving to the second world. But it's been great so far.
Yeah, we are all gambling on that, but everything is kind of coming together very slowly. In some places more than others. I really do feel like something is starting here. Forgive me, Quill. Do you have any last question before my final question of the night?
No, not a question, but just exactly what you're hitting on is the things that I'm hopeful for too. Just today, I was lucky enough to have 2 like fresh conversations. Went and got lunch with a few brand new people that reached out to me, and like always blown away by the quality of people that find themselves, coming to the Old Glory Club and what the exact same thing we're building in America. And that's what I'm hopeful for.
And before I ask my question, I will just say it is my dream to have all of these various communities work together as friends. I know this separates me from a lot of nationalists, but I am a right-wing internationalist, and it's my dream that these communities work together for the good of all our peoples and the good of the future. And I think something, we don't really even understand what exactly we're building yet, but we have the general outline. But okay, well, I'm going to ask my final question before I hawk the book again. So, Johann, I think a lot of people are looking at the world and they're struggling with what they can do that is positive. So, two-part question. What advice would you give to somebody who is, I've noticed 2 different groups of people who are looking for answers because they come to me with questions. And the first group of people are the people who are younger guys in their early 20s, not quite established, but maybe some leads. And then the second group of people are people more in my age cohort, married with children, stable job, kind of doing this as a side hustle, not to mean that I'm not committed, but very much locked down. And both of them are just wondering, what can we do to help? What is the things that we should be looking towards to do in our own lives to kind of follow in these patterns? Now, obviously, the first thing you should do is buy Johann's book. But what other advice might you give them?
Yeah, well, I'm always a bit reluctant to give dating or marriage advice to younger guys. I'm I'm in my mid-30s. And I basically just got very lucky. I met my wife quite young, and she's just wonderful and always has been. So I think I just kind of won that lottery. So I don't want to present myself as someone that has all the answers. But what I will say is that the people in my network who have succeeded at something similar through an intentional act of will have done the, go to church and find a trad wife thing. I say that somewhat ironically, but have done it actually seriously. So they haven't just gone to a local church once a Sunday on a single slot and kind of waited for the perfect woman to show up at the pews. They've gone the kind of maximalist version of that. So they visited different churches, different slots, looked at the composition of different crowds, joined church youth WhatsApp groups, gone to church youth events, gone to international events, pilgrimages. They really are like calling back to an older age of social intensity that we're very unfamiliar with now. There's if you ever go into, this is such a crass analogy, I apologize, but it's what popped into my head. If you ever go into sales work, basically the number one problem that every young guy going into sales has is they don't realize the volume of leads that they have to generate to actually make sales. I'm sorry, this is a horror. I wish I'd never gone down this path.
Well, I
but
think
it
it's
is
a good
true.
analogy. You know, they say sales is the skill everyone should know, but yeah, please continue.
The point is that like we live in an age of such degenerated social fabric and intensity that you're actually considered a social person if you go out once a week for some kind of in real life social meeting. But like older generations, you know, you read Bowling Alone or any of those, like that's in the 50s and with Robert Putnam. But certainly if you go, I have this wonderful book called Merry Old England, which is like a social calendar of pre-Victorian England. It's just intense. Like they are just meeting family, friends, cousins, neighboring villages, religious communities. It's this very thick social fabric. And so what I would say is like the first thing you need to be doing is radically increasing your surface area and intensity of engagement. And those guys have found wives, people who have really committed to that journey. The corollary of that is the older generations. And this is where I see my personal responsibility rather than, you know, I don't want to be that older guy banging on the heads of young people being like, just work harder, pull yourself up. It's actually building the infrastructure to make that happen. And I devote a lot of the book in the later chapters to building out calendars of social events that are necessary for these social to act as the vessels for these social interactions. And you know, a lot of older people now throw up their hands and they say, well, my son is struggling to find a wife, my daughter is struggling to find a husband, but what am I supposed to do? I don't know any young people and they wouldn't listen to me even if I tried. And that of course has always been the case, and yet communities have always overcome that. Like it's completely recognized. We think now that marriages are difficult to make happen. It's difficult to find your partner. That has always been true. You know, if you go back to the novels of Jane Austen, what the whole engine of the drama is how difficult it is to overcome all of the emotional, procedural challenges of finding a mate. That has always naturally been a component of human existence. But what has changed is that the infrastructure that society underpinned, the rigorous, well-funded, well-supported, ritualized, multi-generational infrastructure that was necessary to overcome that natural inertia has completely gone. And so we can actually rebuild that, even if it's just like as patriarchs, we host more multi-family gatherings, holiday trips with multiple families, sponsor events attached to local colleges, schools, churches. Like there's a lot that can be done, and there's communities that are doing this successfully. And indeed, ideally using whatever wealth we can, a very healthy way to pass on whatever material abundance we have is to spend money on these events, make them luxurious, make them stand out, give the youth a chance to participate in social settings which are glamorous, which are attractive, which people want to attend because you've actually rented out quite a nice restaurant or hotel or whatever.
Yeah.
Like these things, like people don't even think to do them now, but you absolutely can do them. You know, you can give your house to your children to if you have a nice house, to host events. And basically the point is that like this is a multi-generational compact, and yes, you never want to be like, hello fellow kids, like walking up to women on the street being like, would you like to meet my son Simon, you know, whatever. that's tragic, and that's obviously a lot. But there are sort of like there's a construction to be done here to rebuild the social infrastructure that's been lost.
I think that is a very good challenge for all of the people of my generation, because I feel this challenge, and you know, it's a struggle because our generation of millennials, older millennials, is not. I mean, we're doing okay, but we're not in the commanding position that our parents were in. You know, with all these assets that are just exploding at their time, but we still have the responsibility. I don't think that the fact that we're encountering these problems means that we can shirk from this duty. But those are all of my questions, Johann. Could you, there's this wonderful quote that I'll end on, the Psalm 112 that you quote at the beginning of your introduction. I'll read that as our outro. But can you just tell people where they can find your work? And obviously, you can get his good book on Amazon, but any other places, if people, they can find your work to support you and support your project?
Yeah, no, it's. I'm afraid it's an Amazon exclusive for now. This was like a one-man, very amateurish show, and so the path of least resistance was taken on everything except the writing. So it's on Amazon. But yep, check out the book "Leaving Legacy," Johann Kurtz on Amazon, and then I also write at becomingnoble.substack.com.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And I did buy multiple copies. So if you are going to any of the California events of ours that we have upcoming, you can, and you're one of the first 2 people, you can buy one of my copies, or one of my spare copies, because I'm certainly keeping this one. But the inspirational speech, psalm that I will end with, because I love the Psalms. And it's Psalm 112. Their descendants will be mighty in the land. The generations of the upright will be blessed. Wealth and riches are in their houses, and their righteousness endures forever. They rise in the darkness as a light for the upright. They are gracious, merciful, and righteous. So excellent words of wisdom. And thank you, Johann Kurtz, again. You're an inspiration, and I'm looking forward to finishing this book, but it's a wonderful read so far. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Good night, everyone.